to Athens all the way from Jamestown, Tennessee, Mr. Clark Matthews. He's going to be talking to us in the first of a two-parter about the life and times of Mr. Champ Ferguson of Tennessee, I believe.
Yes, sir.
So, y'all come tonight, you're going to get part of the story, but you got to come back next month and get, as they say, the rest of the story. All right? So, without any further ado, Mr. Clark Matthews.
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can y'all hear me? If I get too quiet, just do this and I'll try to talk louder, but I don't like speaking in microphones. They mess me up, so I'll just try to be loud. But I appreciate y'all having me. I appreciate Lee inviting me down. It's about a 240-mile trip down here from northern Tennessee, but it's exciting. I actually used to live over in Jackson County, Alabama, so it's always great to travel back down to the great state of Alabama and talk. I'll give y'all a little bit of background about me before we get started, and then I have a couple of disclaimers. So, first, I grew up as a boy that was a history nut. I loved history, and I was the type of kid that would take his history books home from school, and I'd read them, and I'd be ahead of the class. When we get into whatever topic we were discussing at school, I was 7 or 8 chapters ahead of the rest of the class. I loved everything from the Native American wars, when the Indians were fighting the white settlers that were moving into this area, Revolutionary War, the War for Southern Independence. Loved all that. Was really big into it, but one man that I did not learn about in those history books was Champ Ferguson. Although Champ rode and fought in the same hills and hollers that I grew up in, they didn't teach me about him in school. I had one 5th grade teacher that said, there was a man that fought for the Confederacy in this area. His name was Champ Ferguson, and after the war, he was hung for what he did in Nashville. So that struck my interest. So I start trying to find out more. I start talking to older people, going to old country stores, talking to old men. I find out that I had a 3rd grandfather that was killed by Ferguson's men. I find out that I had a cousin that rode with Champ Ferguson during the war. I find out that Champ Ferguson killed the man that killed another one of my 3rd grandfathers. So I just started getting more and more into it. Researching on the internet, looking for everything I could find, old newspaper articles. The Nashville newspapers had a lot of good one-on-one reports with him. Read all of that. We'll throw that thing out the window. Sorry about that. So I started researching him, and then as I was older, I was able to get online and start looking and found that there had been several good books wrote about Champ Ferguson. So if y'all like what you hear tonight and next month, I encourage you. Most of these books are still in publication and you can order them online. Champ Ferguson, Confederate Guerrilla by Thurman Simpson. There was a college professor from Cookeville, Tennessee, Troy D. Smith, wrote a fictional biography called Good Rebel Soul. My personal favorite is Confederate Outlaw, written by Mr. Brian McKnight. Cumberland Blood, Champ Ferguson Civil War by Thomas D. Mays. There was a college professor from Western Kentucky, William Montel, a man that I was able to meet before he passed away, but he wrote Civil War in the Kentucky-Tennessee Upper Cumberland. Really good book, got a lot of information about Champ Ferguson. And then Champ's #1 enemy that you're going to hear me talk about tonight was Tinker Dave Beatty. There was one book written about him. It's Tinker Dave Beatty, His Life and Times. The Union may have won the war. Champ may have been hung for what he did after the war. There was 4 books written about him and only 1 book written about Tinker Dave Beatty. And they were total enemies throughout the war. But I've got a lot of research on him, and if I don't cover anything, I'll open up the floor for questions after the presentation, and I'll see if I can answer your question. Tonight, we're going to go and talk about the execution we're going to talk about Champ's life before the war, what kind of set the stage for him during the war, and then his life throughout the war, and then we're going to stop. When I come back next month, we're going to go through the trial, talk about the trial that lasted throughout the summer of 1865, and then we're going to discuss did he or did he not hang on the gallows in Nashville on October the 20th, 1865. So, before we get started, I'm not here to glorify nor justify the actions that Champ Ferguson took during the war. Champ was by no means a good, moral, law-abiding citizen. What I will do is tell you the truth and explain to you that what he did during the war was no different than what his enemies were doing. And number two, if at any time tonight it sounds like I say something good about Abraham Lincoln or any of the citizens who chose to remain loyal to the federal government during the war for Southern independence, you heard it all wrong. Abraham Lincoln absolutely had no right calling on his federal forces to invade and destroy the South simply because we wanted to leave the Union. We were free sovereign states when we joined the Union, and it was definitely our right to leave the Union if we chose to do so. So we clear on that? All right. So let's go back in time. The date is October the 20th, 1865. A little over 6 months after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. A little over 6 months since Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. We're in Nashville, Tennessee. Newspapers are reporting that the corner of Stonewall and Church Street looks like a circus. Over 300 people had obtained tickets to see the execution of Champ Ferguson. Hundreds more were trying to get inside the prison, but there were guards outside restricting them from doing so. October the 20th was the execution date that had been set for Champ Ferguson. Inside the prison, Colonel William Rufus Shafter, Union Colonel, was the one set to oversee the execution. He opens the prison cell and he motions for Champ to come outside and say his final words to Champ's wife and his 16-year-old daughter. Champ didn't know if he was going to get to see his wife and daughter prior to his execution, but they were allowed to come down and spend the night with him before he was executed. Champ says his final words to his wife. He hugs her, he kisses her, and then he says his final words to his 16-year-old daughter, Anna. She hugs him, screams out, "Farewell, my poor, poor papa." They tie Champ's hands behind his back. They lead him out onto the courtyard. Many witnesses that were there were friends, ex-friends, and neighbors of Champ Ferguson. They said as they were escorting Champ through the courtyard that he kept a strong posture. He bowed at many of them that he knew, and people started going crazy because there had been rumors circulating throughout the crowd that his sentence might get lessened to life instead of execution. You see, folks, while Champ was locked up in Nashville throughout the summer of 1865, the prison guards had took a liking to him. And Andrew Johnson, who's now president because Lincoln had been killed, his nephew was the warden of the state penitentiary in Nashville. He had made the trip to Washington 2 weeks prior to Champ's execution date to visit his uncle and try to get his sentence lowered to life. He had started liking Champ. They made Champ a deal that if he would wear a chain and ball, he could freely roam throughout the prison and he wouldn't have to stay in his cell while he was there. He liked that deal a lot better because he could roam around and talk to people. So a lot of rumors were going on. People didn't think that he would actually hang. They laid him up on the gallows. Colonel Shafter tells Champ that, "Champ Ferguson, you have been found guilty on 53 charges of murder, being a border rebel, a guerrilla, a murderer, and a thief. And he said, I'm up here to oversee your execution. He asked Champ if he has any final words. Champ says, I have a great deal to say, although I don't know how to say them. I'm ready to die. Colonel Shafter then reads the specifics of each charge off. As he's going through the specifics, Champ would either nod his head in agreement, and a few times he blurted out. Whenever they read the charges of him killing 12 Negro soldiers at the Battle of Saltsville, Champ shook his head in denial. When he read the charges of him killing Elam Huddleston, he yelled out, I can tell it better than that. He then asked Champ if he understands the charges. Champ nods his head yes. He asked him if he has anything else to say. Champ says, when I am dead, I want my body placed in this box. He nods toward the coffin that's in front of the gallows. Delivered to my wife and carried to Sparta and buried in pure rebel soil. They then had a pastor come up, say a prayer for Champ. He said a prayer, asked the Lord to have mercy on Champ's condemned soul, and at this time Champ Ferguson starts crying. He then asked Colonel Shafter for a rag to wipe his eyes. Colonel Shafter removes the handkerchief, wipes Champ's face, whispers some words of comfort in his ear, and witnesses say that Champ regained his posture. Colonel Shafter then asked Champ if he had anything else to say. He had none. They placed the robe over his head, tightened the noose. The signal was given. The rope was cut. Champ hollered out, may God have mercy on my soul. He was hung. So, how did he get there? Champ Ferguson was born in Clinton County, Kentucky. Kentucky never seceded from the Union. Although Kentucky did represent one of the 13 stars in the Confederacy, and they had members of Confederate Congress, they never seceded. Champ Ferguson's, all of his family were Union men. His brother Jim, his brother Ben, they all sided with the Union. So how did Champ Ferguson become a captain in the Confederate Army? So, about Champ Ferguson, a little bit of background on him, but he was born November the 29th in Clinton County, Kentucky. He was the oldest of 9 children. He was named after his grandfather. Him being the oldest son, he was named after his grandfather. His grandfather had a nickname, Champ. He liked to bet on racehorses, and he was successful in betting on racehorses, so his nickname was Champ. When Champ was born, they named him Champion. Now, Wikipedia and some people will argue and say that his real name was Samuel Champion Ferguson. I cannot validate that. I found court records when he was in court in Fentress County, Tennessee, and they say State of Tennessee versus Champion Ferguson. So, Champ, at the age of 22, he marries his first wife, Ann Eliza Smith. They have a baby son, but that marriage only lasted for 3 years, and then Champ's first wife and his son die of unknown illnesses. In 1848, Champ remarries to Martha Owens. Champ and Martha had one daughter, Ann Elizabeth. She was named after his first wife. As farmers, the little family prospered. Champ was ranked in the top 15% in Clinton County, Kentucky for owning land. He was known as an orderly citizen, honest in his dealings, and a man well-to-do in the world, but a dangerous man when exasperated, just like many of his neighbors in that time. Champ inherited his father's family farm in Clinton County, Kentucky. One of his hobbies that he enjoyed, there was a racetrack in Clinton County, and he would go and bet on racehorses, just like his grandfather. Back in those days, everybody made whiskey, and they would drink a lot of whiskey while they were at these racetracks betting on horses. And a lot of times after being there all day drinking whiskey and gambling, fights would break out. Champ and his brother Jim were both known to be very good fighters. Many people that knew them from the racetrack days said you didn't want to mess with Champ and Jim Ferguson. They both like to fight, and when they get liquored up, they're mean guys. So, In 1858, there's two brothers from Fentress County, Tennessee. Now, if we're looking at a map, and I'll talk a little bit about geography because I know you guys aren't in that part of Tennessee, but if y'all look at a map today, there was no Pickett County, Tennessee back in 1858. Fentress County went all the way to the state line, bordered Clinton County, Kentucky. Overton County, Tennessee went all the way to the state line and also bordered Clinton County, Kentucky. Now the state boundary lines are the same as they was back then. But these two boys from Fentress County, Tennessee, Alex and Floyd Evans, they travel up to Clinton County, Kentucky looking to buy hogs to drive them off to the market. They don't have the money to pay for those hogs, but they talk Champ, his brothers, and several other neighbors in the community into selling them hogs on credit. They do have a promissory note that has signatures from 7 well-known citizens in Fentress County backing them. So, Champ and his neighbors, they sell these Evans boys some hogs. Well, it comes time to settle up, and they haven't been paid. Well, they run into Alex Evans one day, and they done him for their money, just like anybody would. And Alex tells them, boys, I ain't got your money. My brother Floyd took the money, and he ran off. He left the state. Well, Champ and his neighbors don't believe that story. So Champ tries to do the right thing, and he travels to Overton County, Tennessee, and he files legal suit against the Evans boys. He then also goes into Clinton County, Kentucky, his hometown, and files legal suit against them there. He wins both of these judgments against the Evans boys. Now that he's got legal judgments against them, he starts attaching himself to their livestock. Anytime he catches them with a horse, cow, pig, whatever, he takes it. He confiscates it. He takes it to the sheriff in Clinton County, Kentucky, across the state line, and that sheriff orders it to be sold at public auction. And that money is to go toward the debt that they owe him. Well, this goes on for some time, and the Evans boys, they decide they can't stand it no more. They've got to do something about it. So they seek legal help in Fentress County, Tennessee, and get a judgment against Champ and his brother Jim. And they are given the advice that the next time they catch a Ferguson in Tennessee, to go for the nearest justice of peace and have them arrested and taken to Jamestown. Well, Champ doesn't know all this. This whole deal's coming to a close though, because Champ steals a horse from Alex Evans. And I believe it's in July of 1858, he takes it back to Albany, his hometown in Clinton County, and the court dismisses it. They won't order it and have it sold at auction. So Champ knows it's pretty well over. His hometown, they're dismissing his attachments against the Evans boys. And I honestly believe he thought it was done. Now, back in those days, church camp meetings were big social gatherings. There's a Presbyterian church in the Lick Creek community of Fentress County, Tennessee, and Champ decides to ride his horse over there into Tennessee and go to that camp meeting one night. Now, what Champ doesn't know is that the night before, his brother Jim had visited Alex Evans' farm and stole another horse. So he goes on and he goes to the camp meeting. The Evans boys find out he's there, and they go for the nearest justice of peace. That justice of peace happens to be Jim Reed. He's a cousin to the Evans boys, and he's a constable there in Fentress County. Well, Champ's at the camp meeting. They start forming a lynch mob outside the camp meeting. Several people warn Champ, hey, you need to get out of here and go back into Kentucky. There's going to be trouble. They've got a constable. They're going to get you. Champ wasn't worried about it. It goes on. The mob keeps getting bigger, and finally Champ decides, hey, I better go ahead and get out of here. So he comes out of the church. The mob comes after him. He jumps on his horse, and he takes back off to Kentucky. Now, Champ later tells the newspaper reporters, I wouldn't have had any trouble at all getting away from them. However, the little horse that I chose to ride that night was a mare and foal, and she stumbled when I went to cross the creek, and he fell off of her. So the mob catches up to him. He's still on the Tennessee side. First man to get a hold of him is Floyd Evans. Well, they start throwing rocks and fighting with each other, and Champ pulls his knife out and stabs Floyd Evans several times. He gets Floyd Evans off of him, and the next person to get a hold of him is Constable Jim Reed. Champ said Jim Reed was a much bigger man than Floyd Evans, and I don't know what come over me, but when I started cutting him, I just couldn't quit cutting him. And he also said, I know my knife was razor sharp, I just sharpened it that day before I went to the camp meeting. He kills Constable Reed that night. Third man to get a hold of him is Elam Huddleston. Elam gets a hold of him. Champ pulls his knife back, and Champ stated, I never will forget how Elam Huddleston looked at me with those bright blue, evil eyes before he jerked away and hightailed it in the other direction. Well, Champ's got a little bit of a lead on the mob then, and he runs, and they run him into an old house. He goes upstairs in the house, and he has a standoff with them. He said that when he got up the stairs of the house that he grabbed a bed wrench. Y'all know what a bed wrench is, the old beds with ropes, and you tighten the ropes with them. So he's standing at the top of the steps with the bed wrench. Won't let anybody come up the stairs. Well, by then, the sheriff of Fentress County, Jim Wright, has showed up. And he talks Champ into coming downstairs and surrendering and turning himself in. He tells Champ, if you'll come down and surrender, I'll see that there's no harm done to you tonight. We'll take you to jail in Jamestown, and we'll let the court system deal with you. So Champ agrees to surrender. Jim Wright takes Champ back to the camp meeting where it all started, and he ties him up outside at the camp meeting. Ladies that were there at the camp meeting said Champ looked awful when they brought him back. He was covered in blood. The crowd's everybody screaming and hollering. They know that he's killed Constable Reed. And Reuben Wood, who was a neighbor of Champ Ferguson, talks Jim Wright, the sheriff, into getting Champ and getting him on out of there before they kill him. On their way to Jamestown, Alex Evans gets a shot off at Champ, but he missed. So Champ's brought him back to Jamestown, Tennessee, and he's charged with killing Constable Reed, and he's locked up in the Fentress County Jail. He spends about 3 months in jail before he's even able to obtain a lawyer. Well, after 3 months, he obtains a lawyer, and guess who that lawyer is? Willis Scott Bledsoe. Scott Bledsoe was a 20-year-old brand new lawyer. And Champ gets him as a lawyer, and Bledsoe gets a bond set for Champ Ferguson. So Champ gets out on bond after spending 3 months in jail. I think the bond was about $6,000, which was big money back in those days. He had to sign his farm up in Clinton County in order to get the bond. He bonds out. Willis Scott Bledsoe was one of the first men to raise a Confederate cavalry when Tennessee seceded from the Union. Also, Jim Wright, the sheriff of Fentress County, was pro-secession. The judge of Fentress County was pro-secession. Champ later tells people after the war had started that the only reason he fought for the Confederacy was because he was told that if war did come to the States, if he sided with the Confederacy, that he would never be prosecuted for killing Constable Reed. Well, I do know this for a fact. I was able to link up with the Fentress County Historical Society and get the old record books. We go back and we find the case in the books. Champion Ferguson, the state of Tennessee versus Champion Ferguson. We find the specifics of the charges where he was charged with killing Constable Reed. We find out that there's 9 continuancies in that trial from 1858 all the way up till 1861. 9 continuancies, and no record that Champ was ever in court again. Also, after those 9 continuancies, there's 6 pages that's been cut out of the book. It'll almost made the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I seen those 6 pages and touched them with my fingers. They'd been cutting out of the book. Shortly after the war began, and after Champ Ferguson had killed a couple of men, he admitted that he went to George Kingston, the Fentress County Registrar's house, and cut the pages out of the book so that he would never be prosecuted for killing Constable Reed. So, Champ's living on the border, divided territory. The entire upper Cumberland region of Tennessee, as well as southern counties in Kentucky, which bordered Tennessee, were both heavily divided during the war for southern independence. This area suffered hard during the war, as it was truly a war of brother against brother. In this rural, rugged, mountainous region, Champ Ferguson was for secession and sided with the rebels, while his brother Jim Ferguson remained loyal to the Union and sided with the Yankees. Both Champ and Jim were very strong men and known for their hot tempers and willingness to fight. Throughout the local communities, both brothers vowed to kill the other if they crossed paths during the war. Champ did have another brother, Ben, who remained loyal to the Union but was not active in combat, as he stayed home to take care of their mother. Most of the folks in Champ's hometown of Clinton County, Kentucky, was pro-Union, but just south of there, in Overton County, Tennessee, the folks were mainly for secession. The lines were heavily divided in other neighboring counties for Champ, such as Fentress County, Tennessee, and Wayne County, Kentucky. After the war really got started and heated up, Champ Ferguson found great comfort living deeper south in White County, Tennessee. So, the war comes, Tennessee votes for secession, and people start having to pick a side. Now, I'm sure it was no different here in northern Alabama. There was no remaining neutral. Many of the farmers in the mountains of Tennessee wanted to be neutral. They didn't own slaves, they didn't own plantations. Most of them just had little small backer farms, and they just wanted to remain neutral, tend to their backer farms, and stay out of it. But, folks, there was no remaining neutral. You had to pick a side. And there was a code in them mountains that's still there today. If somebody's your enemy, they're your enemy. How can they be your friend if they're your enemy? You had to pick a side, and no matter what side you picked, you automatically were prescribed 40 to 50 enemies just as soon as you picked a side. Champ Ferguson decided to side with his lawyer friend Scott Bledsoe and join the Confederacy. His brother Jim decided to do like most men in Clinton County, Kentucky, and side with the Union. Now, there was a Confederate camp in Fentress County, Tennessee, Camp McGinnis. It was a recruiting and training camp. That was the farthest camp north in that part of Middle Tennessee, and it was in Tennessee, Camp McGinnis. Scott Bledsoe was stationed at Camp McGinnis. If you wanted to fight for the Union, you went north of Clinton County, Kentucky to a camp called Camp Dick Robinson. It was up close to present-day Danville, Kentucky. So all the damned old Lincolnites, as Champ called them, went to Camp Dick Robinson, and the good Southern men went to Camp McGinnis. Well, Champ hadn't really been combating. He really hadn't took a stand either way in the war, but people got to noticing that he was making more trips to Camp McGinnis in the evenings. They'd see him on the road to Jamestown going toward Camp McGinnis. Champ and Raines Philpott and John Denton, another one of his buddies, were traveling to Jamestown one night, and they run into some boys that they know from Clinton County, Kentucky, the Duval brothers, Van and Bug Duval, and several more. They speak to each other, they go on. Well, them Duval boys start thinking that Champ's going to go to Camp McGinnis and tell Scott Bledsoe that they're in the area. They'd already chosen to be home guards for the Union Army. So they go back and they arrest Champ, Raines Philpott, and John Denton. and they tell them that they're going to take them to Camp Dick Robinson. Champ didn't want to go to Camp Dick Robinson. That was a Union camp. He didn't want to go there. They hold a gun on him. They arrest him. They tell him that's where he's going. He remained a prisoner with his hands tied behind his back for 3 nights. Well, he never did make it to Camp Dick Robinson. There's a lot of talk on whether they just decided to turn him loose before they got to Camp Dick Robinson, or if they were able to escape. No one knows for sure, but he got away, Rains, Philpott, John Denton, they all got away, and they didn't go to Camp Dick Robinson. However, that was the turning point for Champ Ferguson. From that day forward, people that knew Champ Ferguson said he became a mean man. He didn't like being held at gunpoint and told to do something he didn't want to do. And shortly after that, he was seen at a local blacksmith shop. He had a rifle with him. He was ordering another rifle. He had a revolver with him that needed repaired and was ordering another revolver to be made. He had a big Bowie knife with him, and he said, I want another one just like this made. Somebody said, Champ, what are you going to do with all them weapons? He said, I'd like to let them damn Yankees catch me unarmed again. So he started becoming well armed, and just a few days after that, he's with Rains Philpott again, and they run into some guys in Clinton County, Kentucky, that say, Champ, you better watch out. William Frogg's going to kill you. William Frog was a man that Champ Ferguson grew up with, knew him well. Champ admitted, I'd known him my whole life, and William Frog was a much stouter man than me. Well, Champ says, I'll take care of this right now. So he goes to Frog's house. He doesn't know it, but William Frog's in bed upstairs sick with the measles. William Frog's wife comes out on the porch. She greets Champ. She offers him some apples that she's peeling, invites him in the house, and tells him that her husband's upstairs in the bed sick with the measles. Champ goes upstairs. He does find William Frog sick in bed. There's also an infant in the room and a young, I think 12-year-old boy that was a neighbor there in the house. He has words with William Frog. Frog tells Champ, I'm a very sick man, I've caught the measles. Champ says, I reckon you got them measles at Camp Dick Robinson, didn't you? Frog says, no. Champ says, I know you've been to Camp Dick Robinson. He pulls his revolver and he kills Frog while he's laying there in bed. Shoots him in the head. That's one instance. A couple days later, him and Rains Philpott are leaving Albany, and they're driving some pigs down the road. His old neighbor, Reuben Wood, steps out in the road. They stop, they have words. Champ accuses Reuben Wood of being at Camp Dick Robinson. Reuben admits that he had been to Camp Dick Robinson. Champ said, well, I have to kill you, Reuben. They have a fight. He kills Reuben Wood, however, he didn't die instantly. He lived for a couple days to tell about it, but he does die. That's the kind of mountain guerrilla warfare that started going on. Now, throughout 1861, Champ pretty much had it made. He was siding with the Confederacy. Union forces were north of the Cumberland River, Camp Dick Robinson. They hadn't gotten south of the Cumberland River yet. Ferguson, guerrilla, and Scott Bledsoe, they're patrolling heavy. They're making raids, going up into Champ's old hometown of Clinton County, Kentucky, and robbing pro-Union houses and farms, getting stuff to supply the Confederate armies, and things are going good for Champ Ferguson. Well, something happens, the Battle of Mill Springs. If y'all haven't ever researched it, but the Battle of Mill Springs is where General Zollicoffer falls to Union forces and allows the Union Army to come south of the Cumberland River. That's when Union forces started getting into Middle Tennessee. Well, Champ Ferguson wasn't at the Battle of Mill Springs, but he was reported to have been in White County, Tennessee, and after Mill Springs, they realized that federal forces are going to start coming heavily into Tennessee. They broke the line, they broke the barrier. So they start going, and trying to recruit anybody and everybody they know that's not fighting to join the Confederacy. Well, they make a trip to a man's house. The man's name is Tinker Dave Beatty. I don't know if any of y'all have ever heard of him, but they make a trip to Tinker Dave Beatty's house. Champ and Scott Bledsoe do. Beatty's not there, and they tell his wife that they've said, you let him know that we were here and that the wars came to this area and that he has to pick a side. If he's not going to fight on our side, then he needs to leave the country. Well, Beatty happened to be out in his field and he seen them visiting in his house. He shoots at them as they're leaving, injures one of their men, but Beatty reported at Champ's trial or testified that after that visit, Ferguson and Bledsoe kept returning to his farm every 2 or 3 days for several weeks. They never could catch him there, though. Well, Tinker Dave Beatty decides that he is going to pick a side, but it's not going to be for the Confederate States of America. He's going to remain loyal to the Union, and he's going to form his own company of independent scouts to fight Champ Ferguson and his men. So Tinker Dave Beatty forms a company of independent scouts. These men were no better than Champ Ferguson. I got told a lot, and I get a lot of criticism for talking about Champ Ferguson. People in my area say, oh, he was a mean, wicked man. He shot people in the beds. I said, well, what about Tinker Dave Beatty? Oh, he fought for the Union. He was a good man. He actually got a bunch of money after the war. Well, let me just say this. If you think Tinker Dave Beatty was any better than Champ Ferguson, just ask the family of Bobby Richardson. Bobby Richardson was a 92-year-old man who had done nothing other than 3 of his sons decided to side with the Confederacy. Tinker Dave Beatty and his men go to Bobby Richardson's house. He's blind, he can't see, he has to hold on to the walls inside his house. They drag this 92-year-old man out of his house, stomp him and beat him to death in his front yard, kill him, and then shoot his dog and throw his dog down on top of him. Also asked the family of James Payne. James Payne was a non-combatant Southern sympathizer, had no military action whatsoever. They go to his farm, chase him out of his house, run him into his barn, tie him up in his barn, and butcher him with a knife, simply because he was a Southern sympathizer. So you can't tell me that Tinker Dave Beatty was any better than Champ Ferguson. Another thing I like to always say, Champ went through an extensive trial in 1865. Not one time did a woman ever come forward and say that Champ Ferguson raped them throughout the war. There was several reports that he called his men awful women when they tried to disrobe them. Tinker Dave Beatty was in trial in Fentress County, Tennessee for rape before the war ever started. There were several reports that him and his men raped Confederate sympathizers' wives throughout the war. So you cannot tell me that Tinker Dave Beatty was a better man than Champ Ferguson. So, Battle of Mill Springs, Union forces start coming into Tennessee. Champ decides he's going to have to join up with a bigger group of men. So, he links up with John Hunt Morgan. Y'all know who John Hunt Morgan is, right? Champ becomes a scout for John Hunt Morgan and his men. They start making raids up through Kentucky, sometimes going as far as Indiana and Ohio with these raids. Morgan was very successful every time Ferguson was a guide for him. Ferguson knew the terrain. He knew Kentucky very well. He was a good fighter. And Morgan was successful every time Ferguson was with him. General Basil Duke was who Champ reported directly to when he was riding with Morgan's men. He bragged and boasted on Champ, and he said, although we were all part of John Hunt Morgan's men, the men looked up to Champ Ferguson when we were riding. They all took a liking to him. One funny story I do like to comment on, they were coming back from a raid into Kentucky, and they got into a little town in Kentucky called Tompkinsville. And Champ finds out that there's a wealthy man there in Tompkinsville who at the start of the war had been a Southern sympathizer, but he had turned the coat and sided with the Union. He'd put a $5,000 bounty on Champ Ferguson's head, and he was there in Tompkinsville. Champ finds out about it. He goes and sees the man. He said, "I heard you got a $5,000 bounty on my head. I've come to collect it." Well, the man offers him $5,000 in Confederate money. Champ said, "That won't work." He said, "Well, I'll give you $5,000 in U.S. currency." He said, "That won't work either." Champ left there that night with $5,000 in gold, collected the bounty on his own head. He rides with Morgan. Morgan has a lot of success. Eventually, they split ways. Things kind of go south for Morgan. During one of those raids, they're on their way back, and Champ gets permission to ride out with some men and go after some local home guards that he knew were in the area. Morgan gives them permission. He sends Basil Duke with them. They go to the home of Rufus Dowden. Rufus is not there, but there is several Union men there. One of those men, Elam Huddleston. Elam Huddleston goes all the way back to the church fight before the war. And Champ finds out he's there, and they have a shootout. They set the house on fire. They drag Elam Huddleston out, and Champ kills him in the front yard with a knife. Basil Duke scolds him. He says, "Champ, this is formal military here. We can't be treating prisoners like that." Champ says, "I know. This is a different situation. This is the only time you will find anyone that can validate Champ Ferguson tells this story." He tells Basil Duke and his men that are there that shortly after the war began, that Elam Huddleston and 10 other men visited his farm in Clinton County, Kentucky while he was away, burned his barn, went in the house, forced his wife and daughter to disrobe, cook them a meal, and then walked them up and down the streets naked in front of it, up and down the road. He tells that story. He said, "That's why I killed Elam Huddleston the way I killed him." Well, he tells that story, and then it starts spreading all throughout the Southeast during the war. Soldiers all over as far as Georgia and North Carolina were reporting, "There's a Captain Champ Ferguson in Middle Tennessee, and he's fighting like hell." And the reason he's fighting that way is because of what these Union soldiers done to his wife and daughter. And they said that it was a very popular story that was told around many campfires throughout the war. Champ never admitted that that story was true after that. He was asked up until the day he was executed if those men had mistreated his wife and daughter that way. He said they didn't. So I don't know. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But he did tell it. Basil Duke actually noted it in his book that Ferguson told him that, and that's how that story got started. But things are going good all the way up until 1864. Now, I think it's important to note because by 1864, the South was getting battered pretty hard. I mean, let's all admit it. By 1864, Sherman had come to Atlanta. They were whooping us all over. Things weren't looking good for the South. But Champ Ferguson he kept equal forces with federal forces in Middle Tennessee. They'd deal him a few hard licks. He'd turn right around and deal them some hard licks. But by 1864, he realized he could no longer operate independently. So he reports to General Joseph Wheeler, commander of cavalry in the Army of Tennessee. Wheeler orders Ferguson and his company to duty with the Army of Tennessee with General John S. Saragordo Williams. They get up with Williams in White County, Tennessee, and they began moving to Atlanta to join the fight down there. Well, they go east going toward Atlanta. When they get to Rogersville, Tennessee, well, before they get to Rogersville, Tennessee, something happens. Ferguson and his men find out that John Hunt Morgan has been killed. And they find out that when John Hunt Morgan was killed, that the Yankee soldiers paraded his dead body through town on the back of a horse. Well, that made them mad because most of them had rode and fought with Morgan. So Williams reported that when Ferguson and his men find that out, that they lost any little bit of discipline that they had left in them, they lost it. He said there was no taking quarter, no giving quarter. Any prisoners they captured after that, they hung them instantly. He said they lost all discipline they had. They were mad. Well, Williams gets orders to change course and to come to Saltsville, Virginia. That's where federal forces were planning to attack a Confederate salt works. Well, they arrive, and although heavily outnumbered, the Confederates take a victory that day. On the right side, where the main attack came from, that's where Ferguson and his men were stationed, along Chestnut Ridge. And the South was successful that day. Again, Champ Ferguson was there. They were successful. Well, something out of the ordinary had happened at this Battle of Saltsville. There was a company of U.S. colored soldiers there. I believe it was the 5th United States Colored Cavalry that was there with the Union Army. And they were fighting Ferguson and his men. After the battle had ended, Ferguson and his men stormed the battlefields. They were killing wounded soldiers. Now, a lot of people will tell you they were just killing colored soldiers, but that's not true. If you look at the statistics, they killed just as many white wounded soldiers as they did black ones. Champ said he didn't kill any of them, but that some of his men did, and he didn't stop them. There was several reports there that Ferguson looked like a madman after the battle was over. Number one, it was probably one of the first real battles that Champ Ferguson had seen. He'd been in all kinds of skirmishes and stuff, shooting and fighting through the hills, but as far as lining up on a battlefield, it's probably one of the first big ones that he had seen. But he also found out that there was another federal group there, and that was the 13th Kentucky Cavalry. And he knew that his ex-brother-in-law, Lieutenant Elder C. Smith, was a lieutenant with the 13th Kentucky Cavalry. Champ found out that Smith had been wounded that day while they were fighting. He starts looking everywhere for him, going into houses where hospitals had been set up, looking everywhere for Smith. Well, he finally finds him. He's in the upstairs of the Emory and Henry Hospital, there close to Saltville. And Smith's laying in bed. There was reports, eyewitness reports, that when Smith seen Ferguson come into his room, he raised up and he said, "Is that you, Champ?" Champ shot him in the head and killed him while he was laying in the hospital bed. Now, some people say that Smith was one of the 11 men that made a visit to Champ's farm in Clinton County, Kentucky, and mistreated his wife and daughter. Other people say that Smith knew the agreement that Champ had made with the Confederates in Jamestown prior to the war, and that Champ felt like he had stabbed him in the back when he sided with the Union, knowing that Champ was going to side with the Confederacy. A lot of other people will tell you Champ had a friend in the Confederate Army, Colonel Oliver P. Hamilton. He was a fighter, and he had died. Smith was responsible for killing him earlier in the war, so people say that Champ was seeking revenge for that. But he shoots Smith in the head. Well, this is late 1864. Champ gets in trouble, and the Confederate authorities court-martial him, and he's put in jail in Virginia. Well, then Lee surrenders in April of 1865, and the Confederacy starts dissolving, and they turn Champ loose. A lot of historians will tell you that if Champ would have just come home and went back to farming and remained quiet, he probably would have never been prosecuted. He didn't know. He gets out, and by May of 1865, he's back in Jamestown, Tennessee. One of the first places he goes is to a house where Tinker Dave Beatty's at. He kicks in the door, finds Tinker Dave Beatty sitting at a dinner table. Champ has about 13 men with him, and they arrest Beatty. Make him saddle his horse up. They tell him to take him to the Taylor farm. Well, Tinker Dave Beatty said, "I knew they knew their way to the Taylor farm as well as I did, so they were just going to try to get me away and kill me." So he comes up with an escape plan, and he turns his horse to where they have to be shooting toward each other, and he gets away, but they do chase him and they do shoot him 3 times. Unfortunately, he still lived, but they shot him 3 times. He got away. They then go back into Clinton County, Kentucky, and they make a visit to the Duval farm. Those 2 Duval brothers that captured him at the start of the war, Van and Bug Duval, they ride up to their farm. Duval boys has been fighting for the Union Army throughout the whole war, but they'd went way north into Kentucky because they were scared to death of Champ Ferguson. They came home though. They thought the war was coming to an end. Champ and his men ride up. Bug's sitting on the porch. One of Champ's men pulls a revolver and goes to shoot him, and Champ says, "Whoa, don't shoot, that's Bug Duval. I've known him my whole life." Calls his man off of him. They take off after Van, Bug's brother, and another man, John Hurt, and they kill them down in the field. Champ then comes back, and he rides up to the house where Bug's at. Bug testified that Champ got off his horse, come sit on the porch, asked him how he'd been. Said, "The war's been hard on us all, hasn't it, Bug?" Bug said, "Yeah." He said, "I killed Van down there, killed your brother down there." They exchanged a few words. Champ got a couple horses from the farm and they rode off. That was the last man reported that Champ Ferguson killed. Now, my thoughts on that is they were captured at the start of the war by Van and Bug Duval. Nobody knows for sure if they escaped or if they turned them loose. I think Bug Duval probably had some part in them getting loose and not ever making it to Camp Dick Robinson, and that's why Champ didn't let his men kill him after the war. Champ goes back to White County, Tennessee, and while all this is going on throughout the war, it didn't take Champ long to have to move his wife and daughter out of Clinton County, Kentucky. They get on deeper south into Sparta, Tennessee, in the Calf Killer Valley. That's where his grave's at. And throughout the war, I think the Yankees burned his house twice, but he didn't have a house to come back to. Rufus Dowdy had raided his farm once while he wasn't there, found some mustard rolls hidden in a den tree, destroyed them. He testified in the trial that he did destroy them. But he comes back. You can imagine it's 1865. Confederates are laying down their arms all over the South. Many of them's taking the oath. Orders come down from Nashville to let any Confederate soldier surrender if he agrees to take the oath, except for guerrillas. They didn't want to take a surrender from guerrilla soldiers. Well, there's a man by the name of Colonel Blackburn. He had fought with Colonel Stokes throughout the war in Middle Tennessee, fighting guerrilla fighters. So he tells General Thomas in Nashville, said, "I know how these guerrillas operate. I know them. I fought against them. If you'll give them the same deal that you're giving all these other Confederate soldiers, they'll lay down their guns and quit too. If you don't, they'll never quit fighting." So General Thomas gives Colonel Blackburn the orders. He said, "Go to Middle Tennessee and take surrender of any guerrilla soldiers that want to surrender, except for Champ Ferguson." Folks, they hated Champ Ferguson. Andrew Johnson, who was the military governor of Tennessee, had gotten so many complaints on Champ Ferguson that he hated him. And he was scared to death of Champ. Champ had a $2,000 bounty out on Andrew Johnson's head. So Blackburn comes to Middle Tennessee. He meets with a group of guerrillas, and they're all laying down their arms, taking the oath, surrendering, and they find out that Champ and about 100 of his men are a mile away in the woods wanting to talk to him about surrendering. He agrees to go talk to them. Champ comes up. He says, "Champ, I've got orders. Any of your men that want to quit, lay down their arms, they can take the oath, and they can go back to their farms and go to working, except for you. I've been given orders not to let you surrender." Well, Champ asked Blackburn to go back to Nashville and ask General Thomas to reconsider. Blackburn tells him that he will, and that if General Thomas agrees, he'll send a couple of men for him in a couple of days. Well, all Champ's men surrender. Champ goes back a couple days later. Some men ride in and say that Colonel Blackburn sent them there to get him. Champ thinks that General Thomas has agreed to let him surrender. He admitted, I thought they would ask me to take every oath in existence, and I was willing to do so, could I live free. However, he said, if any of them home guards ever come back down here around me, I will kill them. But he saddles his horse up. They get him about 2 miles out of White County, Tennessee. They pull guns on him, ties hands to his saddle, take him to Alexander, Tennessee for the night, then to Nashville. He's incarcerated, took to the state penitentiary there in Nashville, and that's where he stayed throughout the summer of 1865 while his trial was going on. Now, I don't want to tell it all because I'm coming back next month, so we'll talk about the trial, talk about some of the testimonies, who testified for Champ, who wouldn't testify for Champ, and then we're going to talk about did he hang on the gallows October the 20th, 1865, or did he make a deal with some of those guards while he was in prison and they let him get away and go out west. Now, one personal story I want to touch on real quick, I forgot, was my third great-grandfather, Rod Powell. Him and Champ knew each other prior to the war. Ferguson actually encouraged my grandfather to ride with him and side with him during the war. My grandfather, he wanted to remain neutral. He said, no, he said, I've got a wife and family. Boys, I can't be fighting. I just want to stay out of it. But there was no remaining neutral. Well, Rod's two oldest sons decide to join up with Tinker Dave Beatty and his men after they raised a company of independent scouts. So Rod then feels obligated, and he's in his 50s, so they allow him to have non-combatant service, but he feels obligated to help the Union Army. He starts riding because the federal government didn't pay Tinker Dave Beatty and his men during the war, but they would supply them all the ammo that they needed. So my grandfather starts riding up into Fort Nelson in Kentucky and getting ammunition and bringing it back and supplying Tinker Dave Beatty's men. Well, I learned all of this from a widow's pension that my grandmother submitted, but my grandfather made a trip to Fort Nelson and he returned with his saddlebags full of cartridges. He was sick with the fever. He told my grandmother, I'm going to deliver this ammunition to Claiborne Beatty, which was a son of Tinker Dave Beatty's. Then I'm going to come home, rest for a few days, get to feeling better, and then I'm going to go back to Fort Nelson. Well, while he was at home recovering, Ferguson's men come to the house, drug him out of bed, took him 2.5 miles down the road, about 1/4 mile from where I live now, shot him 13 times and cut a gash across his chest. I always wondered why they shot him 13 times, and I had to do a lot of digging, because I had a cousin that was one of those men that done it. My grandmother named every one of them off in her widow's pension, and she knew all of those men to be Ferguson's men. So I start doing some digging, and I find out that he was a prominent enough citizen in the community that none of them wanted to be charged with killing him, so they made a truce that every man had to shoot him at least once, so that they couldn't say just one person killed him. So a lot of people ask me, they said, well, why are you even doing a presentation on Champ Ferguson if his men killed your grandfather? Well, let's go to the other side. Brother against brother was no different for me living on the border. I had another third grandfather, Campbell Alexander Huddleston, who was actually involved in the battle at Stones River. He had gotten injured, came home for a little while, was on his front porch with my grandmother and some Union guerrilla soldiers, ride up and shoot him and kill him while he's standing on the front porch. So the lines were divided in with my ancestors just as much as they were with Champ Ferguson's. I had, when I started doing my genealogy, I had several Union soldiers popping out at me. Then I start digging on this other side, and I've got Confederates coming out at me. So I just had to pick. My heart belongs to Dixie. I was born and raised in the South. That old flag right there has always meant something to me. It means a lot more than a war. It stands for sweet tea, bologna sandwiches, pinto beans. I love that flag, and I love Dixie. It was a terrible war. I had a great grandmother that was living. She was a small girl during the war. My oldest uncle can remember her well and remember her stories, but she never would talk about the war other than it was a bad time. It was a bad time. So for years, people had to quit talking about it in my area of Tennessee, and that's the only way they got over it. And we can find out more through history and old newspaper articles and stuff than we could 30 years ago, because people quit talking about it. And that's the only way they got over it. It was so much brother against brother, so much rough stuff that people just quit talking about it. My cousin that rode with Ferguson, when you really dig into it, that was his uncle that he took part in killing. His mother was a sister to my grandfather. About a year after he killed my grandfather, my other two cousins were part of Tinker Day Beatty's men. They went and killed him and his brother-in-law. There was a circuit riding minister in the area of Fentress County that kept a journal and throughout the Civil War, and I found that murder in his journal. He talks about him being killed by Sherman Powell, and how Thomas Riley was a well-to-do man. He just had got married, and that he begged to see his new wife, who was only about a half a mile away from where they killed him, but they wouldn't let him see his wife before they killed him. They went ahead and killed him. She died 3 months later from a broken heart, is what they say. That's all I've got for tonight. Y'all got any questions?
What do you say about the Bowie knife?
So, this is not his actual Bowie knife. It's similar to one he would have had. So this is interesting because somebody does have this one of Champ Ferguson's Bowie knives. It's in Indiana right now. But I'm going to be speaking and giving this presentation in Union City, Tennessee, Sunday. And there's a retired college professor from the University of Kentucky that called that camp commander. He'd seen my flyer on the internet and said that he had one of Champ Ferguson's old swords. He's going to drive from Somerset, Kentucky to Union City and bring that sword, so we'll get to see it. But I didn't talk a whole lot about that, but a double-bladed Bowie knife was Champ Ferguson's favorite weapon. If you read these books, I won't go into all the details, but many of his men that he did kill, after he killed them, he would, let's just say he'd use his Bowie knife too. I won't go into details.
Andy first.
I came in late, but what did he do before the war?
So he was a farmer before the war. He was the oldest of 9 sons, but he had a dispute with 2 brothers in Fentress County, Tennessee, and that led to a skirmish, and he killed a constable in Fentress County, Tennessee, and he was arrested in Fentress County, and he got his lawyer that got him out on bond was one of the first men to raise a Confederate cavalry company when Tennessee seceded from the Union, and Ferguson was one of his first recruits.
Well, since he was so good at killing, I just wondered if he had been an outlaw.
No, and that's an interesting point because Champ Ferguson, if you Google Civil War serial killer, they will say he was a serial killer. But he was 37 years old before he ever killed his first person, and that was Constable Reed. 4 years before the war started.
Robert, last question, Robert.
My email.
Why was he charged of two types of murder? Was it first degree murder and second degree?
53 counts of murder. They didn't do first degree, second degree, but his specific charges was 53 charges of murder, and then being a border rebel, guerrilla, murderer, and thief.
And one more quick one. Whenever I forgot who died, but someone at the very end of the presentation died from like a dead heart. Was that from depression?
Broken heart, yeah. Yep. So a lot of times, and I know you're young and I appreciate your interest, but when you start researching this, a lot of times widows of Civil War soldiers would grieve themselves to death after they lost a loved one. But they probably just quit eating, and then that caused them to get sick.
All right. Thank you, Clark. We will get you.
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see this big crowd here. It's always a lot easier to speak in front of a big crowd than it is a small crowd. So I appreciate y'all coming out tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces. Most of y'all were here last month when we spoke about Champ, and we talked about Champ's life before the war and during the war. And we left off with when he was arrested on May the 30th and took to Nashville and put in prison for the crimes that he committed during the war. So tonight, we're going to go through the trial, talk about the trial, and then we're going to talk about, did he hang on the gallows in Nashville on October the 20th, or did he not? I'll be quick tonight. I know y'all got a lot of business, but I do appreciate y'all coming out. And at the end, I'll open up for questions and discussion if y'all have anything. So last month when I was here, I told y'all that on May the 30th, 1865, Colonel Blackburn finally sent a couple of men to White County to get Champ to take him into Nashville. Champ thought that Colonel Blackburn had went back to Nashville and asked General Thomas to reconsider his surrender terms. So Colonel Blackburn told him that he would go back to Nashville, and if General Thomas reconsidered, he would send somebody for him. Two men that rode up to the farm where Champ was working, he didn't have a house because the Yankees had burned his house during the war, but he was working trying to rebuild his farm, and they found him unarmed. It was the first time there had been a Union soldier that had found Champ Ferguson unarmed in 4 years. So they tell Champ that they've came to get him. They're taking him in to see Colonel Blackburn. Champ peacefully agrees to go with them. He saddles up his horse. They permit him to go back to his house and get his pistols. My thoughts are they didn't want him to suspect anything, so they said, yes, you can go get your guns. He goes to his house, he gets his pistols, they ride off, they get him about 2 miles away from his farm in White County, Tennessee, and they disarm him and tie him to his horse. They then take him to Alexander, Tennessee, where he's turned over to Colonel Blackburn, and they keep him overnight, and then he's taken to Nashville the next morning and locked in the state penitentiary. So, when Champ gets to Nashville, he realizes that they're not going to turn him loose. They put him in a state penitentiary, and they tell him that they're going to prosecute him for war crimes. They charge him with 53 murders, being a border, guerrilla, rebel, murderer, and a thief. 53 murders from 23 different instances. So, just so happens, there's a very well-known lawyer in Nashville who was well respected and was a strong secessionist and stood behind the Confederate cause. Judge Joe Gill. He steps up and he agrees to be Champ's defense lawyer. Now Gill, when Nashville fell, he had refused to take the allegiance to the United States government. He had been taken to a prison camp up in Michigan and held with 3 other men for 6 months until he finally caved agreed to take the oath of allegiance, and then he was permitted to come back to Nashville. So when he finds out that they've brought Champ into Nashville, he steps up and he says, I'll be his lawyer. I'll be his defense lawyer. There's also a young Confederate captain by the name of R.M. Goodwin. He decides that he'll assist in the case and help defend Champ on trial. Well, we all know by June of 1865, Confederates were on the run. 84 people were subpoenaed from Champ's defense team to come testify on his behalf. Only 4 showed up. Out of 84, many of Champ's friends throughout the war, Captain Bledsoe, General Dibble, they were all subpoenaed, but they never did show up in Nashville. And we're talking about a trial that lasts throughout the entire summer of 1865. It officially kicked off June the 10th of 1865, and it didn't wrap up until September the 18th of 1865. Now, this is a military trial. It's the federal government that's prosecuting Champ. So it's a little bit different than your regular court system. A judge's advocate's appointed, and he's basically the prosecutor. They bring a man in, Captain H.C. Blackman, and he's actually the judge advocate over the case. He's the prosecutor. Now, 43 people showed up in Nashville to testify against Champ Ferguson. But of all the people that they subpoenaed to show up on his behalf, only 4 showed up. Only one of those had any credit, and that was General Joseph Wheeler. Y'all know who Fighting Joe Wheeler is. He showed up to testify on Champ's behalf. The other 3 were just neighbors, and they were basically just character witnesses. Of the 43 men that showed up to testify against him, the first man they called to the witness stand was Tinker Dave Beatty. That was Champ's strongest enemy throughout the Upper Cumberland during the war. All these people come, they're testifying against Champ, they're talking about the cruel things that he done. We talked about some of those things last month, some of the skirmishes, some of the people that he killed while they were wounded in bed. Not one time was there ever anybody out of 43 people that mentioned anything about Champ Ferguson trying to rape a lady or even mistreat a lady. Tinker Dave Beatty was on trial in Fentress County, Tennessee for rape before the war ever started. Tinker Dave Beatty did rape several women throughout the war. But again, the South lost the war. Champ Ferguson was put on trial for killing men during the war. Trial's going on, things aren't looking good for Champ. Finally, in August, the trial's coming to an end. Joe Wheeler shows up in Nashville to testify on Champ's behalf. Now, Joe Wheeler's not doing too good himself because he just got out of a federal prison up in Delaware for helping President Davis escape after the war. So he gets out of federal prison in Delaware, makes the long journey to Nashville to testify for one of his men. The night before he's scheduled to be in court, Colonel Blackburn and one of his officers go to his motel room. They knock on the door, Joe comes to the door, and Colonel Blackburn starts beating Joe Wheeler with a cane while his officer held a pistol on him. They beat him black and blue. Finally, they said some people that was there in the hotel felt sorry for Joe and they pulled him off of him, just some innocent bystanders. Despite all that, Joe Wheeler still shows up in Nashville the next morning, walks into the courtroom on a cane, beaten, battered, bruised up, cuts all over him, and he testifies on Ferguson's behalf. Now, he didn't know Champ until the latter part of the war, but he did tell the court that it was his understanding throughout the entire war that he always heard Champ referred to as a captain. That's one of the charges that they had him up in court for, was for being a guerrilla. Now, Wheeler told him it was his understanding that Champ received his authority from General Edmund Kirby Smith in April of 1862. General Smith never commented on it, whether he gave Champ he commissioned him as a captain or not. But Joe Wheeler told the court it was his understanding that General Edmund Kirby Smith gave Champ permission to raise a company of cavalry scouts and to operate on the Tennessee-Kentucky border and to be the captain over them. All throughout the war, he was referred to as Captain Champ Ferguson. There's also a man by the name of Rufus Dowdy. Now, he was a Union man, a Union guerrilla fighter. But he testified at the trial that during the war he had made a raid on Champ's farm in White County, Tennessee, and had found some muster rolls hidden in a hollow tree, and that he took them muster rolls and he'd burn them. So there was some muster rolls that had Champ listed as a captain, and it had several men on it. There's actually some muster rolls that survived, but they weren't brought to court, and the military court didn't think that Champ was ever a commissioned officer in the military, so that what he did throughout the war, he was just a guerrilla and a border rebel. Well, by September of 1865, they wrapped the trial up. Champ's lawyers are pushing for continuancy because they say that none of their witnesses have showed up. The court doesn't give them any more time. By September, they find him guilty on 53 murder charges, being a border rebel, guerrilla, murderer, and a thief. They sentence him to be hanged by the neck until he is dead, and they set his execution date for October the 20th, 1865. Now, after this sentencing hearing, Champ starts getting lots of time and attention from newspaper companies. Throughout the whole trial, people would travel to Nashville to see the notorious Champ Ferguson. Champ and his lawyers had a lot of fun with these people. They would come in the courtroom and ask to see the notorious outlaw Champ Ferguson. And they would always tell him it was some other man in the courtroom, and newspapers, reporters would observe him and say, I agree, he does look like a mean man. And Champ would be over there laughing about it. But Champ made a lot of friends with the prison guards and the warden of the prisoner, who happened to be Andrew Johnson's nephew. Now remember, Lincoln's already been executed for his war crimes, so Andrew Johnson's the president. Andrew Johnson's nephew is the warden of the state penitentiary in Nashville. He makes Champ a deal that if he'll agree to wear a ball and chain, that he'll freely let him roam throughout the prison, rather than being locked up in a cell. So that's a pretty good deal for Champ. He takes it. He's able to freely roam. A lot of the guards started liking him. They would get him to tell them stories about his service in the war. And Andrew Johnson's nephew made the trip to Washington 2 weeks prior to Champ's execution date to plead with his uncle, to have Champ's sentence lessened to life in prison versus execution. Now, Andrew Johnson does not like Champ Ferguson. Champ caused a lot of problems for Andrew Johnson because remember, when Nashville fell, Andrew Johnson was the military governor of Tennessee. At one time, Champ Ferguson had a $2,000 bounty on Andrew Johnson's head. So Andrew Johnson had been fielding complaint letters and stuff throughout the whole war, and he don't like Champ Ferguson. So he tells his nephew, no, we're going to let the law take its course. I'm not doing anything. So October the 20th rolls around, and the execution's still set to take place. Now, I did bring one thing, and this was Champ's final statement to the newspaper after his sentence was handed down, and this was 1 week prior to his execution date. He protested that he was taken prisoner under false pretenses and that he should have been given the same parole as all other former Confederates. This is a famous quote. I was a Southern man at the start. I am yet and will die a rebel. I believe I was right in all I did, and I don't think I done anything wrong at any time. I killed a good many men, of course, I don't deny that, but never killed a man whom I did not know was seeking my life. He went on to state that it was his understanding that the Federals would never have taken him alive, and this made me kill more than I should have done. Champ told newspaper reporters he estimated he killed about 123 men throughout the war. When asked about his religion, he said he did believe that there was a God that ruled the universe, and the best he could tell that the old man had been on his side this far, and he didn't think he would leave him now at the end. He professed to be a Campbellite, which is the disciples of Christ. He said he guessed that was as good a religion as any of them, and he was ready to die if he had to die. But he told the newspapers a week before his execution that God was going to stick with him and see him throughout this. Well, October the 20th comes. I told y'all last month the details, but Champ Ferguson is hanged. His body's put in a casket, delivered to his wife and daughter, and they leave Nashville on their way back to White County to bury him. By 1868, newspapers start getting reports, people calling in and reporting that Champ Ferguson is alive and well, that he didn't hang on the gallows in Nashville that day. There was many conspiracies. A lot of people said that Champ had made buddies with the federal guards at the prison in Nashville, and we do know that they did surround the gallows in formation, and that there were some men up under the scaffold, and that when Champ's body fell through the trapdoor, that they grabbed him, untied him real quick, and then placed him in the casket, delivered him to his wife, and that once they got him outside of the city, that he escaped and went to Oklahoma. We don't know for sure if that's true or not. One conspiracy was that he went to Canada. I don't believe that's true. Clementine Dowdy reported in the 1880s that his wife went to an insane asylum in Knoxville, Tennessee, and that the executive over the insane asylum was Champ Ferguson, and she knew Champ Ferguson. I doubt Champ Ferguson went to East Tennessee. East Tennessee was pro-union. Now, another gentleman came forth by the name of T.C. Ferguson from Oklahoma. He claimed that he was the son of Champ Ferguson, and that when he was born and raised, and when he got up to the age to where he could remember anything, that his parents told him that his dad was killed and hung in Nashville, and to not tell anybody. He claimed, though, that he was the son of Champ Ferguson, and that his father lived in Oklahoma. Now, what we do know is that his daughter, Ann, who was 16 at the time of his execution, came back to White County, and she married George Thomas Metcalf. He was a well-to-do farmer in the White County area. Now, there really wasn't any well-to-do farmers in Middle Tennessee right after the war, but for the time he owned about 150 acres and had $5,000 in other assets. He was considered a well-to-do farmer for that time period. She married George Thomas Metcalf, and they still showed up on a census in White County up until 1870. Census records of 1870 shows Ann married to George Thomas Metcalf, and they have a 43-year-old housekeeper living in the house with them by the name of Martha Bohannon. Now, I couldn't find any records that Champ's widow ever remarried, but a lot of historians believe that she somehow changed her name to Bohannon to escape her husband's legacy. In 1872, they moved to Missouri for a short time, and then they ended up in Kansas. Ann and George went on to have 8 children. I've traced down the closest living relative to Champ Ferguson that I've been able to find is there's still one great-great-granddaughter living, and she lives out in Colorado. I reached out to her, offered to buy a plane ticket, fly out there if she would just sit down and talk to me. but she didn't have any interest. Now her daughter, which would be a third great granddaughter to Champ, lives in Texas. She was a lot more talkative, interested in her grandfather, asking me questions about what I knew, but she says that her family really doesn't know anything. It was her belief that her grandfather hung in Nashville. She'd never been told any different. I met with one of Champ's nephews, a third great nephew that still lives in Clinton County, Kentucky. He was a nephew on the Union side of the Fergusons, but he's big behind the conspiracy that Champ didn't hang on the gallows that day. He believes that he went to Oklahoma, sent word in 1870 for his wife and daughter to come to Missouri, and he would stay in Oklahoma, but that he could check on them. Oklahoma and Kansas, not too far apart. They went to Missouri and then they went to Kansas. Another man came forward, his last name was Deeds, Henry Deeds. He claims that he helped bury the body in White County after Champ's execution, and that he was confident that there was no body in that casket when he buried it. Now, I've talked to grave witchers. You can believe what you want to about that. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but they've witched that grave, and they do in fact say that there is a body in that grave and that it's a male. That's all they know. What happened, I don't know. My personal perspective is, as mean as he was, if he had went out west, he would have surfaced a few years later. He was just that type of person. Up until he surrendered to federal forces, he said that he would take any oath in existence and that he would live in that oath, under that oath, if he was allowed to live free, if none of the home guards came down around him. If any of his old home guards from Clinton County, Kentucky came around him, that he would kill them. And he stated that after he was willing to surrender. I think if he would have went out west, he had a very noticeable scar on his face that he received during the war. Somebody would have recognized him. He would have showed back up doing something. And he certainly would have changed his last name. He wouldn't have had a son and give him the last name Ferguson if he was trying to live incognito out west. His wife had changed her name to Bohannon before she went out west. One interesting thing that I found in a book, but it's true because I've been to both sites, to show you how divided it was where Champ Ferguson lived. So if you go to his old hometown in Albany, Kentucky, Clinton County, Kentucky, they have this marker on the courthouse square there. It says Civil War Terrorist. Champ Ferguson, born here in 1821. Guerrilla leader with Confederate leaning, but attacked supporters of both sides throughout Civil War in southern Kentucky and Tennessee. Over 100 murders ascribed to Ferguson alone, hunted by both CSA and USA. Taken after end of war, convicted by U.S. Army Court, Nashville, and hanged October the 20th, 1865. Buried at home in White County, Tennessee. Now just 60 miles south of there, in White County, Tennessee, where Champ is buried in the French Cemetery, and here's a picture of his grave, there is a marker that was placed by the SCV, praise the Lord, that says, Captain Champ Ferguson, Confederate guerrilla. General Morgan's cavalry was joined at Sparta, June 1862 by Champ Ferguson. As guide for Morgan's invasion into Kentucky, Captain Ferguson and his co-fighters were the only protection the people of the Cumberland and Hickory Valley area had against the Federal guerrillas during the Civil War. Ferguson was hanged by the Federals in Nashville, but by his request, buried here in White County. That's how divided it was. And it's still to this day, if you go to Clinton County, Kentucky, and you start asking about Champ Ferguson, people look at you cross-eyed. I was able to link up with his nephew, and he was willing to talk to me. He actually wrote an article for a Kentucky Explorer magazine up there several years ago. And he states how he doesn't believe his uncle was hung in Nashville on October the 20th, 1865. Now, I am 100% confident that he's dead today, folks. Whether he hung in Nashville in 1865 or not, I believe he's dead today. I had a man in Cookeville say, well, if you found a great-great-granddaughter, get DNA, we'll go dig that grave up, see if there's any bones in it. I said, no, it's not that important to me. Let the man rest in peace. I believe he's buried in that grave. If he's not, he's probably buried somewhere west of the Mississippi River. But I am confident that he's dead today, and I hope he's resting in peace. And that's all I've got. Y'all have any questions?
I do.
Yeah.
Where did your personal interest in this come from?
Okay, so I was born and raised in Fentress County, Tennessee. You wasn't here last month, but I had a third great-grandfather that fought for the Confederacy and was killed by Union soldiers. I also, through another limb, had a third great-grandfather that was killed by Ferguson's men. But Champ rode and fought in my hometown of Fentress County throughout the entire war, and he was actually locked up in jail there in 1858 for killing a constable. And at that time, the judge and the sheriff, both of Fentress County, were pro-succession. They knew that war was coming, states were building up, succession was building up, and they promised Champ that if war came to Tennessee, if he would side with the South, fight for the Confederacy, that he would never be prosecuted for killing a constable. Also, his lawyer that he obtained that got him out on bond was Captain Scott Bledsoe. As soon as Tennessee seceded from the Union, Bledsoe raised a company of Confederate cavalry. Champ was one of his first recruits. And again, just like I told you last month, I didn't learn this in the history books, and I loved history all through school. But these woke history books that we have now for kids to read don't talk about men like this. They don't even talk about Tinker Dave Baby. But that was all part of the Reconstruction plan, I guess.
Anybody else?
Yes, sir.
You said on the plaque at the courthouse, it said also the Confederacy was after him. Was that true, or that was just somebody?
Not really. So he got in trouble for what he did in Saltville, at the Saltville Massacre. That was in 1864, and he was locked up in Virginia from the Confederate Army for killing a Union lieutenant while he laid in the hospital bed. That's really the only time that he was in any trouble with Confederate authorities. After Lee surrendered at Appomattox, he was turned loose. Of course, he didn't come back to his farm and go to work. He came back to the border and kept fighting after the Appomattox surrender.
Anybody else? Last chance. All right. Thank you, Clark.
Thank you, guys.